Hi everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of my project analysis series. Today, we are going to talk about Hudson Place Residences. Now, I think a lot of agents will already be talking to you about this project. You'll probably hear things like, because the new Dover land was bought at above 1,500 per square foot, your price confirm protected one. And this entry price is something you won't be able to get again in the future. But the question I want to ask you is this. Is all of this really true? And more importantly, even if it sounds logical, does it actually translate into profit for you? So in this video, we are going to break things down properly. Not just what people say, but what actually matters. The numbers, the comparisons, and where exactly is the sweet spot in this project. The goal here is simple. By the end of this, you should be able to decide for yourself whether this makes sense for you. Let's start off with a quick context. Hudson Place Residences is actually very nearby to Bloomsbury Residences, also another new launch project, basically the adjacent plot. Around 327 units, and the surrounding area still has quite a bit of undeveloped land. If you are going for higher floors, you may get greenery or landed-facing views, but that also depends on the future development, which we'll touch on later. So this will be the flow of today's video. Things that agents are telling you about this project, then project info such as the site plan, the surrounding view, and more importantly, how to identify the sweet spot of this development and who is going to buy from you next. So this video is going to be a little different from the rest because I'm not going to dive too deep into the project info as well as the layout analysis, but more importantly in terms of comparing this project versus others and whether this makes sense for you. So first things first, very important. So if you like more of such content, please feel free to like, share and subscribe, or if you need a detailed consultation, feel free to scan the QR code and reach out to me directly. So first things first, very important. What do agents usually tell you? Not near MRT, never mind, got shuttle bus. We hear this all the time. But let me ask you this honestly. If you really want MRT convenience for own stay, does the shuttle bus actually solve your problem? Probably not. That's more of an emotional or lifestyle decision. So today, I don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on something else. If you are buying this as an investment, will being further from MRT actually affect your rental or your future growth to make money? Let's look at One North area. For example, One North Residences highest transacted is around 1958 per square foot. It is around 7 minutes walk to the MRT. And Hudson Place, let's say on average about 24 to 25 per square foot, not within walking distance to the MRT. So the question becomes very straightforward. If I can buy something cheaper and nearer to MRT, even if it is older, why would I pay more for something that's further away? Is it still worthwhile to buy into Hudson Place at this per square foot? To answer this, we need to look at real data. If you see this closely, these two projects are about 20 years apart. One North Residences TOP in 2009 and Hudson Place estimate about 2029-2030. So we compare two projects with a similar situation, Tanglin Regency and Principal Garden. Tanglin Regency is older but near MRT over here, while Principal Garden is newer but much further away from the MRT. The age gap here very similar to Hudson versus One North, around 20 years. So we are going to look at age and distance to MRT. How does it affect your price? Now, let's look at rental. Tanglin Regency, despite being near MRT and their unit sizes are a lot bigger, rents are about $700 cheaper for a 2-bedroom, roughly around 20% lower. For 3-bedroom, the difference is about 25%. So what does this tell us? Even if you're near MRT, if a project is much older, though the unit sizes are bigger, tenants are still willing to pay more for something newer, even if it's further away from the MRT. This is for rental. Then we look at price growth. We take into account when Principal Garden was launched around 2015, at the point where both projects are at its lowest price point. Then the highest price point in 2026. But however, just one point to take note, in 2026 there's no transaction for Tanglin Regency yet, so we take that in 2025. Tanglin Regency went from 1164 per square foot to 1787 per square foot, around 53% growth. Principal Garden went from 1485 per square foot to 2699 per square foot, around 81% growth. So even though Principal Garden had an initial higher starting price and is further from MRT, the growth rate was actually stronger. So just to repeat, Principal Garden bought in 27% higher, but still can sell for another 27% higher over here. So bringing this back, given one of Residences' highest per square foot transacted was 1,009, we round that up to 2,000 per square foot. Then for Hudson, let's say about 2,004 per square foot. Even if you buy the cheapest unit, let's say 2,223 per square foot, on average, it is still about 2,425 up. At this price point, that's roughly a 20% premium. Can you still buy? Because based on data, further from MRT does not automatically translate to weaker rental or weaker growth. Now, second thing agents will say, land cost. Hudson sure can buy one because it's the same developer who bid 50% for another land nearby. Which, honestly, if you were to have seen the news articles, any and every agent will also send this across to you. The next over plot was bought at 1,556 per square foot, and they will say, Hudson price is definitely protected. Sounds very convincing, right? Let's zoom in at the price point. So at the yellow mark, this is where the new plot was bidded for. Then, over down on the blue side, Bloomsbury Residences was bought in at 1,191 per square foot and then sold on an average of 2,517 per square foot. Then we have Hudson Place that was bidded for 1,036 per square foot, about $100 cheaper. Then we got the new plot at another $500 more expensive. So naturally, we will think that the developer bid for higher means they will eventually sell for higher, right? Same developer sure will have price protection. However, I want you to think deeper. Does higher land cost always mean higher selling price? If the land was bought for $500 per square foot higher, will the developer definitely sell for $500 higher? I can tell you it is not confirmed. Bloomsbury Residences bought in for higher, but end of the day, Hudson Place may still sell for the same price or even average out to be a higher price point. Another example would be Vela Bay in Bayshore area. Land price of 1,388 per square foot, everyone said will sell upwards of 3,000. Ended up starting price of 2,006 plus, average out on a higher per square foot. Let's look at a real example in this case. I have Jadescape and Affinity at Serangoon. Back in 2018, Jadescape land was about 791 per square foot over here, but launch price around 1,007 per square foot. Then we have Affinity, launch around 1,575 per square foot. So here we can see very clearly the higher land cost, but lower selling price. Because end of the day, developers' launch price, right, cannot fall below a certain price point because there's some criteria for their bank loan disbursement that they need to fulfill. But however, to sell higher, it's still completely up to them. Why did this happen? Bought in for higher but sold lower? Because developers don't price purely based on land costs. They price based on competition, supply, and demand. Around Jadescape, there's no new condo, no competitors. So if developer wants to launch this at a higher price point, for buyers, if they want to buy into this area, they've got no choice but to accept this price point. But however, around Affinity, nearby, what other projects do we have? Many. From Florence Residences to Riverfront to Sengkang Grand Residences, all of these projects in District 19 launch around the same period. So naturally, prices are being pressured. Developers don't dare to sell too high just in case they are unable to have a high take-up rate. So end of the day, it boils down to supply and demand in this area. Also, even if a project is launching cheap, with the starting per square foot low, you may also end up paying one of the highest per square foot on the launch day itself without knowing. So one point I want to bring up is this. If in this area, if the developer were to monopolize here, one benefit is that there's going to be price protection. So now, we are going to look at another area whereby a certain developer also monopolizes a certain area. And this area is known to many, it is in Lenton. So those plots, right, in yellow are by Guocoland. Yes, some of these are joint venture, coupled by a few developers, namely Guocoland, Hongleong, TID, but they are basically under the same umbrella of developers. We do have one or two by Soybeal and Kingsford, all these different developers. But as for Guocoland, they are very good at price management and building the project very well. Even for later projects whereby they bid and price higher, they sell to you, you still think it's cheap. That's one good thing when one developer monopolizes the area. They help you in terms of price protection. Now, we come back to one-off area, same for Qingjian. When they bid for the new GLS at 1,005 per square foot, it's actually good. And they are indeed trying to monopolize this entire area. But what you have to remember is that they buy in the new land for $500 more expensive does not necessarily mean they will sell for $500 more. And also, even if a project launched for cheap, the starting per square foot could be very low, very cheap, but you may still end up paying one of the highest per square foot on launch day without even realizing. So for Hudson, how should you think about it? If you are entering about 2.6 to 2.7 per square foot, that's where I think you do need to be a bit more careful. But however, if you are able to get something around 2.3 to 2.4 per square foot, even upwards slightly touching 2.5, I feel it is still a good entry price, especially from an investment angle. So now, moving on to the project itself, site plan is pretty straightforward. For Hudson Place, you do have two blocks over here. Then we have Hudson Place and Bloomsbury diagonally across each other. Bloomsbury Residences is also a mixed development with a slightly bigger land size and lower plot ratio. But one thing to note here is the surrounding land, because a lot of this is still subject to future development. Some of these may be commercial, some residential. So if you are buying purely for the view, especially for long-term hold, you need to consider that your view today may not stay the same. In terms of views, some units face the landed enclave, some towards Bloomsbury, some towards Infinite Studio or commercial building right opposite. Not saying any timing is bad, but which unit you choose and also your exit timing matters, also depending on when you are planning to sell. So we move on to sweet spot pricing. Basically, what is the price point of the nearby new launch? What is the price point of the nearby resale? And who is going to be your future buyer pool? So here we have new launch nearby. One example I have for you today is Hill at 1 North. This nearby new launch should be completed around 2027. Here we see that the highest per square foot, right, has already hit 2.4 per square foot, almost hitting 2.5 per square foot. You may think, here at 1 North is nearer MRT, it's also brand new. 2.4 sounds like a better bargain. But however, we got to zoom in to the floor plan because here at 1 North is a pre-harmonized project. When we look at this, a 3-bedroom at 980 square feet is actually not the case. When you look at the aircon latch, it's quite big. Can fit maybe up to 2 to 3 compressors over here. It's quite sizable. So we do have to take the area, minusing off the aircon latch, and thereby we translate that into the saleable area, and then getting the per square foot if this project were to be harmonized. Yes, it's a new condo nearer to MRT. However, this project is quite small at 142 units. This may impact your resale volume and price support in the future. So if you can buy into Hudson Place, let's say a 3-bedroom at 23, 24 plus per square foot, I do think it's relatively safe. Next, we move on to the nearby resale. I want to bring you to One North Residences, which is the newest resale project, because we also want to see in the resale market, right? What is the price point being transacted? Can we buy into Hudson and sell in the future? Because what I realized is that a lot of these buyers are actually buying for own stay. Here we look at One North Eden's profitability. You realize that profit has reached $741,000, which is quite substantial given that the holding period is just slightly over 3 years. Do take note that these are mainly for the 3 and the 4 bedrooms, but even for the 2 bedrooms, right, I realized that the profit is still really quite decent, close to $300,000. So before I studied into this area, this One North side of town, right, initially I was thinking, One North, isn't it all office buildings where Grab is, where a lot of the tech companies are? The truth is, in the resale market, will there be people buying into this area or not? But however, when I look into facts and data like this, when I do a bit more research, I look at the development's price trends as well as floor plan comparison, that's when I realize, there's actually a bulk of these buyers who are looking to buy into here for own stay. And that is why they are willing to pay this amount of profits, because they want immediate stay, they want into this location, this kind of bigger size units, right? And that's why you see a profitability is being transacted here. But that aside, right, it is also important to know who your future buyer profile is, because that determines your exit in the future. However, there is only so much I can cover in this video, not just the future buyer profile, but also the layout analysis, how this compares to the newest new launch Bloomsbury. You can reach out to me, I'll be more than happy to share with you in person. So to wrap up, Hudson Place is not a project whereby you think that the next land cost is so much higher, so your price point is definitely protected. In fact, that is only part of the story. The real key here is this: your entry price, your unit type, and your exit strategy. And if you are not sure which unit and what entry price to enter into makes sense for your situation, feel free to reach out. Because in projects like this, small differences at entry can make a very big difference when you exit. Thank you, and I'll see you in my next video.